Dambisa Moyo, Alison Evans, welcome to you both to HardTalk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dambisa Moyo, financial crisis is making a lot of donor nations awfully stingy. They don't want to give aid to countries in Africa. Is that something that worries you?
I'm very worried on a very superficial level. I think that the immediate impacts will clearly be there. Obviously, there are many African governments that rely, over 70% of their public purse is actually aid-driven. So obviously there will be an impact. However, I think in a broader context, it's an amazing and fantastic opportunity for African governments to start to innovate away from the aid model that I think has actually not delivered in terms of generating growth and reducing poverty.
Alison Evans, let's just look at the problem. The IMF now currently thinks that aid could shrink by 30% compared to its value in 2008. Is that something that only worries you superficially, or do you think it could be a disaster for Africa?
No, this is potentially a very, very worrying situation. The impact of the crisis on Africa is unfolding daily. I think we're already estimating, and certainly ODI research is beginning to show, that something like Africa will experience an output loss of something like $50 billion in the coming year. This is a massive hole in the national income of African nations. This is not a time to back away from the poorest in Africa. This is a time to redouble our efforts. It's a very serious situation.
Dambisa Moyo, I mean, it would seem that international opinion does kind of agree with Alison Evans. Dominic Strauss-Kahn, the head of the International Monetary Fund, says, I foresee mounting problems for developing countries, saying that we're going to see the third wave of the financial crisis. And he thinks that 26 of the world's poorest nations, half of them in sub-Saharan Africa, need $25 billion in additional funding. Are you not concerned that when you say what you do, that you're really putting that kind of assistance at risk?
We have to basically take a step back and ask what aid has done in Africa. It's been 50 years, $1 trillion of aid that's gone to the continent in many different manifestations. And just to be clear, here we're talking about the big billion-dollar government-to-government packages, or the aid that goes from multilateral institutions to Africa.
I know that's your thesis. Sorry to cut across you. I know that's your thesis, but on this very specific point, $25 billion needed in 2009, says the IMF, to help countries, 13 in sub-Saharan Africa. Are you not concerned that when you say, oh, I'm only worried on a superficial level, that people say, well, that Dambisa Moyo, she says, don't worry about aid, we're not going to give any?
Well, I think, again, I think this is an opportunity for African governments to figure out where they're going to get $25 billion. The reason why we are concerned is because the $25 billion isn't sitting in some account earning interest. This $25 billion is being drawn upon to try and stave what could be a bigger problem for the global economy as a whole. And to that extent, I believe that African governments shouldn't sit back and wait for $25 billion to miraculously appear. They should start to find other sources of that money.
Alison Evans, $25 billion, not very much. $150 billion given to the insurance giant AIG.
Absolutely.
I mean, $25 billion. I mean, that's tiny by comparison.
This is a very small percentage of the kind of global bailout plans that are being discussed, but also of the kind of global fiscal stimulus that's being discussed at the moment and in preparation for the G20. This is the least that the international community should be thinking about for Africa at this moment, and I think it is a potentially dangerous moment for starting to talk about pulling back from the commitment to Africa in terms of a crisis that is not of Africa's own making.
But Alison, I want to ask you that people have generally said, look, African countries have been somewhat protected from the ravages of the financial crisis because their economies simply aren't as well integrated in terms of investment, trade and all the rest of it. I mean, that is true to a large extent.
I think that is true to some extent. The first round effects of this crisis have certainly been less harshly felt in Africa than in other parts of the world, certainly in some of the emerging economies of Asia, who felt very directly the effects of the financial crisis. But we're talking about here a crisis that is now well and truly a real economy crisis. This is a crisis affecting jobs. This is a crisis affecting remittance flows. This is a crisis affecting livelihoods. And those livelihoods and jobs will be affected in Africa like they are anywhere else.
Dambisa Moyo, do you agree with that? I see you're nodding there. So it has affected Africa badly.
It will affect Africa, certainly in at least two ways. One is obviously with the commodity prices where they are. There's obviously a direct impact to the public purse and also to jobs and opportunities across the continent. But it also, as I said, with respect to aid budgets, of course, to the extent that they will be slashed or they will be affected by movements in the exchange rate, it will obviously affect these economies. However, I still maintain that this, African governments should have foreseen this type of a situation. Global policymakers should
Why
have
should
foreseen.
they have foreseen that? I mean,
because
people all over the world didn't. The bankers apparently didn't know it was coming. Governments in the West, with all their fine economists, didn't know it was coming.
Well, what I'm trying to say is that the global economy, the global participants should have foreseen a situation where Africa cannot and should not be dependent on handouts to run their economies. Even without the global crisis, Western governments were already seeing a declining trend in populations, so that their economies were foreseeably going to shrink. So it's time for African governments to figure out how they're going to manage without an aid-dependent model.
Well, I can tell you what one of them, for instance, has said. The Ethiopian Prime Minister Meles Zenawi, addressing the African Union in February, says he wants the G20 summit meeting in London in April, when they discuss reform of the financial institutions to help them get out of the current global mess, that they should be able to enhance the predictability of resource flows to Africa to improve the effectiveness of aid, and he says that there should be no cut in development assistance. You're off message, aren't you, really? I mean, African leaders are saying that. You're saying something different.
Well, that's not completely true, because I was in Rwanda, actually, a week ago, and the president of Rwanda is very, very much on point with the view that I have, that Africa cannot and will not achieve long-term sustainable development or poverty alleviation if it continues down the path of aid dependency. Specifically to the point of Ethiopia, I think the aid model is classically, it shows classically what the problem with the aid model is. If you don't mind, Ethiopia is the second largest population on the African continent. It with 85 million people. It has 2% penetration rates in terms of mobile phones, which has got a lot of evidence to show that this can actually help enhance an economy. And yet, instead of opening the market to encourage people to trade and to encourage more participation amongst Ethiopians, the leadership is focused on aid. To me, again, this is a problem.
Alison Evans, I mean, that's a fair point, isn't it?
I think one could take country-by-country cases here, where you could say that the economic management by incumbent governments has something to be desired. But if we take Africa as a whole, Africa has been more open in the last 8 to 10 years than it has at any other point in its history. Reform efforts, macroeconomic reform efforts over the years have actually led to considerable economic openness in Africa, and Africa has benefited. Africa's growth rates for the last 5, 6, 7 years have been some of the highest in the world, consistently so, precisely because these reform efforts are beginning to bear fruit. Now, I think it's...
But specifically in terms of aid, Ethiopia has for many, many years been a massive recipient of aid, and it's still really impoverished.
In average terms, Ethiopia is still relatively under-aided, in fact, in per capita terms. But the point is that, I think to get to the message around we need alternative solutions, one does not need, and it is particularly dangerous at this moment, to cut aid at its knees.
OK, Dambisa Moyo, I mean, that's the point. However fine your message is, and you're saying it's resonating with Paul Kagame, Rwanda and all the rest of it, the timing's not great, is it?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, I think this is a great time to start to innovate. I mean, we cannot expect a continent to continue to operate in its current form. It's not working.
OK, well, just explain to us. You've just written this book, Dead Aid, Why Aid is Not Working in Africa and How There's a Better Way. But you actually go further than saying aid is not working in Africa. You say it's actually impoverished Africa and impeded economic growth. Why do you say that?
Well, let's just look at the data, for example. We take a case of poverty in Africa was around 10% in 1970. It's now at around 70% of the population. This is at the time when, concurrently, aid flows were rising across the African continent. And by the way, as you know, we have tried many different interventions, whether it's towards targeting poverty, towards governance, aid towards structural adjustment, and so on. So there have been multiple types of interventions, but consistently the results have ended up with a situation where Africa is shearing off, as Paul Collier would say, away from the rest of the global economy.
Paul Collier is the former economist at the World Bank, and he's an academic now. Alison Evans, I mean, aid has done some good, but overall, would you say it's done more harm than good, as Dambisa suggested?
No, I wouldn't agree with that thesis. I mean, I think what, Dambisa, you do in your book is point to some extremely important evidence that aid does not work everywhere at all times, and there are many examples where aid has not delivered on the kind of hopes and expectations we would have. But let's be clear here, aid is part of a much broader picture, and I think it's extremely problematic, based on the evidence and the reading of the same evidence that Dambisa actually introduces in her book, to actually say that aid is causal here. We can identify a whole number of relationships between aid and growth, aid and economic development, but to actually argue that aid is the problem as opposed to part of a much bigger problem about how to stimulate sustainable development on the continent. That's the point.
Is your argument a bit too simplistic? I mean, just one figure, for instance, for every dollar of help that Africa gets in aid, it pays out $5 in servicing its debt. So when you say, oh, it's getting this aid or whatever, you're looking at it in isolation of everything else. You've got to look at the overall picture, as Alison Evans is saying.
There are a number of externalities, negative externalities, that emerge from aid. What I mean by that is when you have an aid-dependent society, it encourages corruption, which is the one that most people are very familiar with. But are you looking at it in
isolation of all the other factors?
No,
you need the overall
it's
picture, as Alison says.
It's part and parcel. Most academics and policymakers will look at the issue of governance as a big problem in Africa. You cannot delink governance from the fact that aid dependency is rampant. And may I also just point out that there is no country on this earth that has achieved economic growth and alleviated poverty through aid. It just has not happened. And so we know what works.
Well, India got a lot of aid, didn't it?
But it's not. Look at where it is growing.
Well, it's integrated
it's not growing at 10%.
But it did get a lot of aid, didn't it?
It did.
I just gave you an example there, then. But you're the expert, Alison.
Not as a country. You're giving me an example of a country that's received aid. Botswana's received aid. But to make a correlation or causality, as Alison points out, between aid and growth is completely flawed.
Okay, Alison?
No, I mean, that is the point. I think it is flawed. And therefore, the thesis that the reason that Africa is poor and not growing is because of aid is very problematic. We do have very good examples of aid being a very powerful supporter of change on the continent. I mean, Mozambique right now, I think, would be a very good example.
But it's helped entrench bad government, Dambisa is saying.
I think the politics around, aid and around governance in Africa go well beyond the kind of arguments that Dambisa puts in her book, actually. I mean, we are talking about systems of governance based on political systems that are very immature, based on very weak relationships between states and citizens. Aid has been caught up in those weak relationships.
But I mean, it does act as a kind of decoy, doesn't it, for a lot of African leaders? I mean, they say, oh, we're getting this money from the Norwegians, the Dutch, the British or whatever, so that's going to help build our schools and our hospitals. I think I'll use my money on buying more helicopters or planes or guns for myself. That does happen right across the continent.
Yes, I mean, there are certainly examples of rapacious elite behaviour in relation to aid, which we all, abhor and certainly don't condone. But I think the fact is that, again, drawing for very simplistic sort of straight lines between the evidence of corruption on the continent and the presence of aid simply doesn't cut it.
Right, Dambisa Moyo, let's just test your argument here. For instance, since 2000, the British government has given $100 million, more than that, to help vaccinate 200 million children in poorer nations, apparently helped save 3.4 million lives. Was that a waste of time?
I think it's important to understand what that type of aid can and cannot do. It saved lives. But can it deliver 10% growth? So
but
that
isn't it enough that it saved 3.4 million
in the long term? In the long term, at the end of the day, governments have to be responsible to their domestic citizenry. That situation, the British government cannot go into Africa every time to help vaccinate 3.4 million. But I'm just saying that it's a band-aid solution.
Is that a waste of time? Because by your book, that development assistance wouldn't have saved the 3.4 million
That's not
lives.
what I'm saying in the book. What I'm saying is that those are band-aid solutions. I myself, I'm on the patron and on the board of
But sometimes you need band-aid solutions.
Well, they're not going to deliver what we need in the long term, which is jobs and growth. And at the end of the day, what I'm trying to emphasize is that, yes, you can have these interventions in the short term, but at the end of the day, you are not going to get long-term development.
Do you stop them overnight, then?
Well, in the book, I recommend a 5-year phase-out program. I think there is scope to extend that, but not an open-ended commitment. I mean, the Marshall Plan, which a lot of people point to as a success, was a 5-year, short, sharp intervention, and I think that's what Africa needs. It doesn't need an open-ended commitment that doesn't have any
Is that feasible, Alison Evans, 5 years for Africa to wean itself off its aid dependency?
I don't think it's feasible. I'm not sure it's desirable. But should we be talking about exits from aid? Absolutely. And in fact, I think for those who work within the aid business, exits from aid are very much on the front burner all of the time. So to sort of suggest that the aid business is somehow simply looking to perpetuate itself, I think is a misreading. Yes, we should be talking about aid exits. The kinds of solutions that Dambisa suggests are precisely the ones on the table now. There's not actually a great deal that's new there. Those elements of a new development financing model for Africa are already being pursued.
We'll look at that in a moment. I just want to ask you that the very key message that Dambisa is giving here is an important one, because even Mela Zenawi, when I said he's saying don't cut off aid, he's also saying don't give Africa just a token voice, give Africa a real voice. And when you say people don't want aid to go on and on in the long term, nevertheless, what Dambisa reflects is a very widespread held sentiment by African people and African governments that they are sick to death of being totally seen as recipients of aid, because it infantilizes them. That's a very important message.
It is, and I think we need to be countering that perception all of the time.
But you
I think
don't.
there are some, well, I think we do. I think the challenge around aid is not to accept the system as it is, but to work harder to improve it. It is to talk about stronger voice within multilateral institutions in the governance of aid, if you like, internationally. It is much more about country-led models of development, where aid recipients define the development agenda and donors work in partnership to support that
But
agenda.
that doesn't happen. I mean, Mela Zenawi in this speech still said we're seen as the junior partners. We still see the conditionalities that the donor nations put when they say to us, you can have this, but these are the strings attached. That still goes on, left, right and centre.
Yes, I think there is a very valid critique about some of the strings that are attached to aid, but it doesn't amount to a critique to argue that aid somehow never works, nowhere in Africa, and that its role in partnering with other sorts of finance is essential for Africa's future.
Okay, Dambisa Moyo, so not aid-led development or as kind of package to get African nations out of this current financial turmoil. You talk about things like foreign direct investment, bond issues, more trade. I mean, what is your kind of blueprint to help African countries get out of the current problem?
Well, fortunately, my blueprint is not something that is going to be hard to explain, because it's basically the blueprint that's been used across the emerging world to achieve the sort of double-digit growth that we've seen in China, in India, in Brazil, in Russia, and across Eastern Europe. These countries are facing challenges, to be sure, in this global climate, but the sort of concoction of trade, not trade with, focusing on trade with traditional partners like Europe and the US, but really trying to become trading partners and building alliances with places like China, to me is imperative. China has 1.3 billion people, 7% arable land. Africa should focus on selling its goods there, and so, instead of pushing up against a door, to Europe, where the goods are clearly not wanted.
Well, I mean, you know very well that lots of people in Africa say they're worried about new exploitation by the Chinese who go in, take their resources, flood African markets with their cheap imports, and also bus in their own workers instead of using local employers. But that's what they say about the Chinese.
The Pew survey has a completely different analysis.
Okay.
They've looked at 15 countries in Africa, and the results are very, very different to what you've just said.
Okay, but Alison Evans, I mean, are those ideas going to work, that sort of market-based growth in the current climate, when we've already seen a fall in trade, foreign direct investment, remittances affecting Africa?
Market-based solutions are definitely part of the long-term solution for Africa. I don't think I would disagree at all. I think there's a huge timing problem at the moment. I think we are all rightly somewhat suspicious of market-based solutions, given the current financial crisis. I think, the current seismic challenges that the global economy is facing do shine a light on some profound market failures, and those are particularly profound in many African nations, and that continues to make the case for development assistance. However, trade, absolutely. Engagement in international capital markets, absolutely. Although, as Ghana is now finding, having done a very successful bond issue, investors from around the world are fleeing back to the OECD countries where they can buy much more high-quality debt. So, yes, but the time may not be now, or possibly within the next 5 years, before Dambisa encourages the phone call to all these African leaders to say, that's it, your time is up. The time is not now to go for a fully-fledged market-based solution.
Dambisa Moyo, Kofi Annan, former Secretary-General of the United Nations, said in January that the global crisis could arrest and even reverse steady, and in some cases dramatic, gains that have been made over the last decade in Africa. Do you think Africa will weather the current financial storm, the turmoil, the stuff we've been talking about?
Well, if the IMF forecasts are to be believed, Africa is projected to have 3.5% growth this year. And just as late as November, which is after the defaults and the failures of the banking system in the United States with Lehman Brothers and so on, they were talking about 5% growth rates. I believe that this is a ship, the African economy is a ship that could be navigated through these choppy waters if the governments take a serious approach towards weaning themselves off of the aid model. Because if we're going to sit back and wait for more aid, it will be a situation where it could get much more negative.
And Alison Evans, just to put that into context, 3.5% projected by the IMF for countries in Africa, as opposed to 0.5% for global growth. So it does show you that perhaps African countries might be more resilient. Do you agree with that? Do you think that they are?
Well, the first thing to say is 3.5% looks very robust, but on a per capita basis in Africa, we're still talking about a pretty major reduction in the growth projection going forward. I mean, population growth is still very high in Africa. So in terms of money in the pocket of a relatively poor African, that's a sort of worrying scenario.
And briefly, finally, to both of you, Alison Evans, do you think that the current crisis is going to perhaps transform the narrative of how we help Africa or work with Africa in terms of the giving of aid, for instance?
I think this is a great opportunity. I mean, no one would wish a crisis of these proportions on anyone, but this is a key opportunity. And where I would say that certainly research at the Overseas Development Institute would certainly support Dambisa is to say, you know, innovation is important. We need to be thinking about different options for Africa. We do know more about African growth than we did 50 years ago, and I think we can do that effectively with aid, not cutting aid at its knees.
Dambisa Moyo, transform.
It's been 50 years and $1 trillion, many different interventions with the aid model. We know what works. There are countries that have been successful while Africa has been spiraling downwards. Let's not try and be clever here. Just copy. Just copy what China's done.
New opportunity, you think,
just
though, out of the
innovate
current
a way out of the situation, and it's possible. I mean, let's just take the case of Bangladesh. $1 billion in just small Bangladesh. They're able to raise $1 billion through microfinance, not relying on multilateral institutions. These are the type of innovations that Africa needs. It does not need any more aid.
Okay, Dambisa Moyo, thank you very much for coming on HardTalk. Alison Evans, straight over to you. Thank you so much.